They laughed first, a rough sound that rolled like tumbleweed across the dust-swept square. The auction block had seen cattle and horses, but tonight it bore a woman in a torn satin gown, her wrists bound in iron and her veil smeared with mud. The chains clinked as she shifted, and the crowd, the drunkards, the debtors, the drifters, jeered as though she were spectacle, not soul. The preacher who had been bribed to sanctify her ruin wiped sweat from his brow and looked away. It was not marriage being sold here, it was desperation given form. Her eyes did not lower, though every man there wanted them to. She stared past them all, into the dusk, toward mountains that caught the last red of day. She remembered her father's voice before the debt collectors came, steady as a hymn. They can take the land, girl, but never bow your head. And so she stood chained, her silence heavier than the iron. The bidding began as mockery. $2 for the pretty slave wife. Someone called. Another shouted 3. They weren't offers, but insults sharpened by whiskey. Each laugh stung sharper than the shackles, and still she did not break. Men leaned forward, grinning, asking what use a bride could be when her pride was so unbending. They laughed louder when no one serious spoke. Then a voice cut through, flat and plain, as though carved from stone. $10. The square hushed. Heads turned. A man stood at the edge of the circle, tall, weather-burnt, his hat pulled low. His coat was patched but clean, his boots dusty from the long road. He had the look of someone who had buried more than he had spoken about. $10. Someone spat. For her. You're a fool, rancher. The laughter started again, thinner now, but he did not flinch. He stepped forward, every eye following. I said 10, he repeated, his tone as immovable as the mountain shadows creeping closer. The auctioneer, caught between greed and unease, banged his gavel. Sold. The crowd groaned, robbed of further sport. Chains were unfastened with clumsy hands, and the bride stumbled forward, her arms trembling from freedom too sudden. The man reached out, not to seize her, but to steady her. She pulled back on instinct, but he said only 6 words, my son needs you to live. The words struck her like a door opening to a room she had not known existed. She searched his face then, the harsh lines, the unspoken grief, and understood something beneath them. This was no man buying flesh for desire or cruelty. This was a father clawing for hope in the shape of another human being. They left together through the thinning crowd. The jeers followed, but quieter, uncertain now. On the road west, silence stretched between them, yet it was not the silence of chains but of 2 strangers circling the edges of fate. She asked nothing at first, but when he finally spoke, it was of his boy, a child hollowed by fever, motherless for 2 winters, whose nights were broken by coughing fits and mornings by hunger. The chains at her wrists had left red rings, but as the night wore on, she rubbed them absently, realizing they no longer defined her. In their place grew something else, choice. He had given her not freedom exactly, but a path away from despair, and strangely, it felt heavier, more binding than iron ever was. When the ranch appeared days later, its fences leaning, its fields barren, she understood why he had walked into that square. The house was not a home but a skeleton held together by his will and his son's thin laughter drifting through the window. And when she stepped inside, the boy's eyes, wide, fragile, searching, met hers as if waiting for a story to begin. The crowd's laughter from that night lingered in her memory, but it no longer burned. It was only an echo now, a sound too small to reach the doorway where a child's life and a woman's choice intersected. And in that intersection, something larger than either chains or freedom had begun to take root. The boy's gaze rooted her in place. His eyes were too large for his thin face, fever having stripped him of the roundness a child should carry. Yet there was something else in them, not just weariness but a fierce hunger for connection, as if every stranger who crossed the threshold carried a chance of changing the horizon of his life. He clutched a small carved horse in one hand, its edges smoothed by years of anxious fingering, and when he saw her, he froze as though uncertain whether to welcome or fear the figure who now stood in his doorway. The man, his father, bent low and set his hand on the boy's shoulder. "This is the lady," he said simply, his voice neither tender nor cold, but matter of fact, as though what had happened in the square needed no explaining in this house. "She's come to stay." The boy blinked. His lips parted as if to ask something, but no sound came. Instead, he looked at her with a question lodged too deep for words. She crouched to meet him at eye level. The chains had been removed, but her wrists still bore the angry red bands, and she instinctively folded her arms to hide them. "What's your name?" she asked gently. He hesitated before whispering, "Eli." "Eli," she repeated, letting the name soften on her tongue. It felt fragile, like glass. "I'm Miriam." The boy's eyes flickered at the sound, not quite a smile, but the faintest tremor of trust. He clutched the carved horse tighter and nodded, as though he had accepted her answer into some hidden chamber of his heart. The father straightened, weary lines cutting deep into his brow. "It's late. Supper's cold, but it's there." He moved to the stove, lifting a dented pot. The smell of boiled beans filled the room, heavy with smoke and salt. She followed, her fingers itching to be useful, though she had not yet chosen to accept the role thrust upon her. "I can serve," she said. He looked at her, not startled, but measuring. Then, with a slight nod, he handed her the ladle. She moved about the small kitchen with a caution born of strangeness, learning the room with her eyes before her hands. The plates were mismatched, chipped on the edges, yet each was clean. She set them before father and son, then sat with her own portion. They ate in silence broken only by the scrape of spoons against tin. Eli coughed between bites, the sound rattling in his chest like pebbles in a can. Each time, his father's jaw tightened. Miriam watched, and without thinking, she reached to rub the boy's back until the fit passed. He leaned into her touch as if it were an instinct older than memory. The father saw, and his eyes lingered on her a moment too long before he looked away. When the meal was done, she rose to clear the dishes, though no one asked it of her. The motion steadied her, reminding her of a home that no longer existed, the hearth where her mother had taught her how to knead bread, the laughter of her younger brothers before sickness carried them off. The ache of loss pressed against her ribs, yet the small act of cleaning another family's plates felt like defiance against despair. That night, they made her a bed in the spare room, though room was generous. 4 walls of rough timber, a cot with a straw mattress, and a single quilt faded by sun. She lay awake long after the house had gone quiet. Outside, the wind slid across the plains, carrying with it the sound of coyotes calling to one another. She thought of the square, of the laughter, of the weight of chains on her wrists, and then of the boy's wide eyes, searching, pleading without words. For the first time since her father's land had been stripped away, she allowed herself to weep, not for herself, but for a child who had no mother to hold him through the dark. In the days that followed, she found herself weaving into the rhythm of the house. At dawn, the rancher rose to tend what cattle remained. His herd was thin, barely enough to keep the place alive, but he worked with a steady determination that spoke less of hope than of duty. She rose too, without being asked, to sweep the dust from the floorboards, to mend the boy's threadbare clothes, to prepare what meager food the pantry held. Eli followed her like a shadow. He watched her every movement, as though afraid she might vanish if he blinked. He showed her his wooden horse, the only toy he owned, and explained in halting words that his father had carved it from a fence post on the night his mother died. She listened, every syllable a stone laid on the path of understanding. One evening, as she sat by the hearth sewing a patch onto Eli's trousers, the rancher spoke. "You weren't meant for this," he said quietly. She did not look up. "Nor were you meant to raise a boy alone." His silence stretched between them, thick with unsaid things. Finally, he said, "I buried her under the cottonwood. She was strong, but fever doesn't care for strength." His eyes drifted to the boy asleep in the corner, his small chest rising and falling with effort. "I told myself I could manage. I told myself he didn't need more than me. But every cough proves me wrong." Miriam set down the needle, her hands trembling. "And you think I can mend what sickness has taken?" He met her gaze, and in his eyes was no demand, only a raw plea stripped of pride. "I think you can give him something I can't." The fire crackled. She thought of the chains, of the way the crowd had laughed, of the humiliation that still burned like a brand on her skin. And yet here, in this house patched with sorrow, she felt something she had not felt in years, the dangerous flicker of belonging. Days turned to weeks. Miriam discovered that the land was hungrier than the men who mocked her in town. The soil was stubborn, cracked from drought, but she worked it alongside the rancher, planting what seeds they could spare. She rose before dawn to fetch water from the well, her shoulders aching from the weight of the pails, yet she carried them without complaint. At night, Eli would press close to her, his thin arms wrapped around her waist as she told him stories her father once told her, tales of mountains that hid giants, of rivers that could sing. The boy's laughter was fragile, breaking into coughs, but it was laughter all the same. The rancher watched them from the doorway, a shadow against the lamplight. He never intruded, but she felt his presence, steady as the earth beneath her feet. They spoke little, yet each word carried weight, like stones carefully placed in a foundation neither dared name. One stormy night, when lightning split the sky and the roof groaned under heavy rain, Eli's fever rose. His small body burned against Miriam's hands, his breath shallow, ragged. Panic clawed at her chest. She had seen fever steal her brothers, had watched helplessly as life slipped away while she prayed for mercy. She would not watch again. She soaked cloths in cool water, pressing them to his brow. She held him upright when the coughs racked his frame. She whispered promises into his ear, not knowing if they were for him or herself. The rancher paced the room like a caged animal, his fists clenching and unclenching. "Ride for the doctor," she said sharply, more command than request. "It's 20 miles, he answered, anguish in his tone. "Then ride." For a heartbeat, he hesitated, torn between leaving and staying. Then he grabbed his coat and vanished into the storm. Miriam stayed by the boy's side through the night. Her arms ached from holding him, her throat raw from singing lullabies she thought she had forgotten. At dawn, when her strength was near breaking, the door burst open. The rancher stumbled in, rain-soaked and exhausted, with the doctor behind him. The doctor examined Eli, mixing bitter medicine, giving instructions. "It's not certain," he warned. "But with care, he may come through." For 3 days and nights, Miriam kept vigil. She fed him broth, wiped sweat from his brow, prayed over every shuddering breath. The rancher slept little, taking shifts beside her, but it was Miriam's hands the boy clung to in his delirium. And when, at last, the fever broke and his breathing eased, she wept into the quilt, her tears falling like rain on parched ground. The rancher touched her shoulder, his rough hand trembling. "You saved him." She shook her head, her voice hoarse. "No, he chose to stay." But in her heart, she knew something had shifted. The chains that once bound her had been replaced by ties far stronger, forged not of iron but of love freely given. She had not chosen this path, yet it had chosen her, and she could no longer deny the pull of it. The weeks after the fever felt brighter. Eli's strength returned slowly, his laughter ringing louder. Miriam taught him to read from a weathered Bible left by the rancher's wife, her finger guiding his across the words. The rancher watched them with a quiet reverence, as though afraid to disturb the fragile miracle unfolding before him. One evening, as the sun bled across the horizon, Miriam stepped outside to draw water. The air smelled of dust and sage, the land breathing in the cool of twilight. The rancher joined her, standing close enough that she felt the heat of his body. For a long time, they said nothing. Finally, he spoke. "That night in the square, I thought I was saving you. But I see now, you were saving us." Her throat tightened. She wanted to tell him of the shame that still haunted her, of the laughter that still rang in her ears. She wanted to ask him if he saw her as a wife or a bargain struck in desperation. But when she turned to meet his eyes, she saw only truth there, raw and unvarnished. The bucket slipped from her hands, splashing water over their boots. Neither moved to retrieve it. Instead, they stood in the fading light, bound not by chains but by something neither had sought, yet both had found. And as the night descended, Miriam realized the laughter of that cruel crowd no longer echoed within her. What lingered instead was the sound of a child's steady breathing in the next room, the weight of a man's gaze beside her, and the knowledge that sometimes the harshest auctions can yield the truest treasures. In the quiet days after the fever broke, Miriam found herself walking the land in the mornings before the chores began. The air smelled of dust and sage, the horizon stretched endless, and the silence pressed so wide it almost felt holy. She would pause by the cottonwood tree where the rancher had buried his wife. The earth there was marked by a simple wooden cross, weather-worn, with no words carved into it. Miriam would stand before it, her hands folded, as if asking the dead woman for permission to take up the space she now occupied. She whispered things she could not say to the living. her guilt at being bought, her terror of being seen as a replacement, her longing to belong without erasing another's memory. The cottonwood swayed in answer, its leaves whispering secrets she could not decipher. When she returned to the house, Eli would be waiting, his face brighter now, though his cough lingered like a stubborn echo. He had begun to follow her into the fields, trailing behind with the small horse always in his pocket. She taught him little tasks: how to gather kindling, how to watch the sky for signs of rain, how to listen for the rhythm of the well's rope so it wouldn't snap. Each lesson she gave him was more than survival, it was a thread in a fabric she did not yet dare name. At times, the rancher watched them from a distance, his eyes shadowed. He worked harder than ever, as though building fences or mending roofs could silence the questions in his mind. Some evenings, Miriam caught him staring at her hands as they stitched Eli's clothes, and she wondered if he saw the iron scars there, the ghost of chains she still carried. Other times, she found him gazing at the cottonwood from the porch, his hat in his hands, as though he owed an apology to the grave beneath it. One evening, after Eli had fallen asleep with his wooden horse clutched tight against his chest, the rancher spoke in a voice roughened by hesitation. "You know they'll talk in town." "Let them," Miriam replied, her needle flashing in the lamplight. "They'll say I bought myself a wife." His words were low, thick with shame. Miriam's hand stilled. "You didn't buy me. You saved me from them. There's a difference." He leaned against the doorway, his silhouette caught between firelight and shadow. "But you didn't choose." "Not truly." She lifted her eyes to him. "Neither did you, when fever took her from you. Sometimes life doesn't give us choice. Sometimes it only gives us what's left, and asks what we'll make of it." The silence that followed was not empty but full, heavy with the truth neither dared speak aloud, that what had begun as desperation was slowly becoming something else, fragile but real. Still, Miriam's nights were haunted. She dreamed of the square, of the jeering crowd, of chains cutting into her wrists. She dreamed of her father's land, the smell of tilled soil after rain, the sound of her brother's laughter before sickness stole it. She would wake trembling, sweat dampening her nightdress, and sometimes she would hear Eli stirring in his sleep, his own nightmares chasing him. She would slip into his room, sit by his bed, and smooth his hair until his breathing steadied. In those moments, she felt like she was cradling not just a boy but the broken fragments of her own heart. The townsfolk, true to the rancher's warning, began to whisper. When Miriam accompanied him to the mercantile for flour and salt, women nudged each other, their eyes sharp with judgment. Men smirked, muttering under their breath, "That's the auction bride," they'd say, their laughter barely muffled. Miriam kept her chin high, remembering her father's words. She bowed to no one. But the sting of their scorn, sensing more than he understood, squeezed her hand as they rode home in the wagon. "Don't listen," he whispered. "You're not what they say." His small voice, fragile and fierce, struck her deeper than any insult. She kissed the top of his head and said, "Neither are you." Seasons turned. The drought broke with sudden rains, and Miriam worked beside the rancher to plant again. Her skirts clung with mud, her hands blistered from the hoe, but she did not falter. She felt the land responding, stubbornly but surely, to her care. It was as though she was mending not just soil but her own spirit, coaxing life from barrenness. Eli grew stronger, his cough easing with each month. He chased chickens in the yard, laughing until he doubled over, and Miriam found herself laughing too, surprised at the sound of joy spilling from her lips. She taught him to read beyond the Bible, scraps of paper, old letters she had hidden in her bundle, anything with words. He soaked it in like rain. After drought, his mind sharp and hungry, the rancher watched with pride softening his stern face, though he said little. One evening, as the three of them sat on the porch watching the sunset burn the sky, Eli asked, "Are you my mama now?" The question struck like a bell in the silence. Miriam's heart clenched. The rancher turned sharply, his face unreadable. Miriam reached for the boy's hand, her voice steady though her chest ached. "No, Eli, you already have a mama, and she loved you more than the whole wide world. But if you want, I can be someone who stays, someone who cares for you just the same." The boy studied her with solemn eyes, then nodded. "I want." He leaned against her, and she wrapped her arm around him, holding him close as the sun sank. The rancher's gaze lingered on them, his expression caught between grief and gratitude, and Miriam knew something had shifted again, deeper this time, as though the three of them were weaving a bond stronger than blood. Yet doubts still gnawed at her. Some nights, when the house was quiet, she would step outside and stare at the stars, wondering if she was building her life on borrowed ground. She feared one day the rancher might wake and regret the choice he made, or Eli might grow old enough to resent her presence, to see her not as family but as the woman who had been auctioned like cattle. The weight of those fears pressed hard, but each morning she rose and carried on, because love, she had learned, was not born in certainty but in persistence. The turning point came one winter evening, when the rancher returned from town with anger burning in his eyes. He had gone alone to sell cattle, and when he entered the house, Miriam saw blood on his knuckles. "What happened?" she asked, rising from the table. He dropped his hat on the chair, his voice harsh. "A man thought it clever to say I bought myself a servant bride. Said I should chain you to the porch so you wouldn't run. I made sure he won't speak so easy again." Her breath caught. "You fought for me." He looked at her, pain and pride warring in his gaze. "No, I fought because I won't let anyone call you less than what you are." "And what am I?" she whispered. He stepped closer, his voice low, rough with truth. "You were the woman who saved my boy. You were the reason this house has laughter again. You are the one who made me believe there's still something worth building." The words struck her like a storm breaking. For a long moment, neither moved, the air between them heavy with everything unsaid. Then Eli's cough broke the silence, and they turned, reminded of the boy who was the heart of it all. That night, Miriam lay awake, her heart pounding with the weight of his words. She thought of the chains, of the laughter, of the humiliation burned into her skin. And she thought of Eli's hand in hers, of the rancher's steady gaze, of the land slowly greening under her care. She realized then that her life was no longer defined by what had been taken, but by what she was building, piece by fragile piece, here in this place of sorrow and soil and stubborn hope. The laughter of the crowd still haunted her dreams, but in her waking hours it had lost its power. For each jeer, she now carried a counterweight. The boy's smile, the rancher's silent gratitude, the fields pushing up green after years of dust. The cruel voices had auctioned her in chains, but in choosing to stay, in choosing to love, she had become something no one could sell or bind. And as winter deepened and the fire crackled in the hearth, Miriam sat between the rancher and his son, their lives bound together not by law or bargain, but by the simple, unyielding truth of survival turned to belonging, and belonging turned slowly, fiercely, into love. The winter settled hard over the ranch, a silence that muffled the land in white. Snow piled against the fences, drifted across the barn doors, and carved ridges along the roofline. The cattle huddled together in the frozen pasture, steam rising from their bodies like fragile ghosts. The house itself seemed to shrink against the cold, wood groaning under the weight of ice, but inside it was warm with fire and the steady rhythm of survival. Miriam learned the seasons through her hands, splitting logs until her palms blistered, stirring pots of beans and salted pork, patching clothes with scraps cut from her old gown, the satin long since frayed into utility. Eli would sit by her side, his laughter filling the corners, his questions unending. The boy asked about everything: how snow could fall so silently, why stars burned without smoke, whether a horse could understand love. She answered as best she could, her words soft enough to plant wonder without breaking the fragile glass of his childhood. The rancher grew quieter in those months. He spoke little, but his silence was not empty. It was filled with watching. The way Miriam leaned over Eli's shoulder as he practiced his letters, the way she stretched her body to hang laundry stiffened by frost, the way her hair escaped its braid to glow in the firelight. He never spoke of it, but his eyes betrayed the gravity of his heart, weighted by gratitude, fear, and something warmer that he could not yet name. At night, when the wind howled against the shutters, Miriam would sometimes sit awake by the fire after both father and son had gone to bed. She sewed or read aloud in a whisper, her voice threading the silence. But more often she simply sat, staring at the flames, remembering. She remembered her father's land, seized by men who signed papers she could not fight. She remembered her brothers coughing blood into their hands, her mother's prayers cracking into sobs, the heavy silence of graves too shallow for dignity. She remembered the auction square, the jeering crowd, the chains biting into her wrists, and the laughter that still echoed like a scar inside her. These memories did not fade, but here in the ranch house, they began to take a different shape, not only wounds but reminders of how far she had come, and how much she still had to fight for. Spring thawed the earth, water trickled through the gullies, turning the pastures green again, and with the new season came a restlessness Miriam had not expected. She felt her body stronger, her spirit steadier, but the world beyond the ranch pressed at the edges of her thoughts. Sometimes, when she rode into town with the rancher, she caught sight of faces from that night, the men who had laughed, the women who had sneered. Their eyes followed her, sharp as knives, but she did not flinch. She carried Eli's small hand in hers, and she knew she carried more strength than their judgment could touch. But the whispers grew bolder. Once, in the mercantile, a woman leaned near and muttered to her companion, "Auction bride." Chained and bought. The words struck like a stone, yet Miriam only smiled, lifted her chin, and asked the shopkeeper for flour. Later, in the wagon, Eli asked why people said cruel things about her. She stroked his hair and told him, "Because some people cannot see past their own bitterness. But you, Eli, you see with your heart. That's worth more than all their words." The boy hugged her tightly, and she knew in that moment that whatever the world thought, here in this family she had a place. The rancher wrestled with his own storms. He feared what the world said was true, that he had purchased a woman, that he had trapped her in a life she had not chosen. He avoided town as much as possible, not for himself but for her. Because each insult directed at her struck him deeper than any fist could. Sometimes he wanted to speak, to tell her what he carried inside, that she was not a bargain, not a chain, but the fire that had kept his boy alive and his home standing. But the words stuck in his throat, caught between pride and fear. He had already lost one woman to fever. He did not know if he could bear to lose another, even if the losing came by her choice. Summer came hot and merciless. The fields baked beneath the sun, and the cattle wandered restlessly, thirsty even with the well running. Miriam worked alongside him, sweat slicking her brow, skirts clinging to her legs. She never complained. When Eli tired in the heat, she carried him on her hip as she fetched water, her body taut with strength he had not expected from her. The rancher found himself watching her with a reverence he could not contain. Sometimes, when she caught him looking, she would smile, not shyly but with a kind of steady courage that undid him more than beauty ever could. One evening, after a day of hard labor, Miriam sat with Eli on the porch while the boy traced the outline of the wooden horse with his finger. He asked if horses could live forever. She laughed softly and said, "Nothing lives forever, Eli. But love can last longer than breath." The boy frowned, thoughtful, then placed the horse in her hand. "Then you keep it," he said. "So love lasts longer." She clutched the little carving, her throat tight, and kissed his head. From the doorway, the rancher saw and felt something shift inside him, something unshakable. But hardship did not sleep long. That autumn, word came of rustlers prowling the outer ranges, stealing cattle from isolated ranches. Fear crept into the valley. The rancher began riding the perimeters more often, his rifle across his saddle. Miriam worried each time he left before dawn, the horizon swallowing him in dust. Eli worried too, though he tried to hide it, asking at night if his father would return. Miriam held him close and whispered, "Your father is strong, and strong men come back." She prayed her words would prove true. One night, the danger came closer. A shout split the dark, followed by the lowing of cattle and the crack of a shot. The rancher burst through the door, face grim. Rustlers. At the south fence. He grabbed his rifle. Miriam stepped forward, her heart pounding. "You can't go alone. I have to," he said. "Then I'm coming." His eyes widened, but something in her expression silenced his protest. They left Eli asleep, running through the moonlit fields to where shadows moved among the cattle. The night rang with chaos, hooves, shouts, gunfire. Miriam kept low, her heart a drum, but when one of the rustlers broke toward her with a knife, she raised the rifle the rancher had pressed into her hands and fired. The shot cracked through the dark, the man fell, and silence spread like a sudden tide. When it was over, the rustlers fled, leaving 2 of their number behind. The rancher came to her, breath ragged. "You saved me," he said. She stared at her shaking hands, the rifle heavy, smoke still curling. "No," she whispered, "I saved what's ours." And in that moment, something changed between them. They were no longer strangers bound by desperation, but partners bound by survival. Blood and soil mingled into one. The next morning, Eli found them together on the porch, exhaustion heavy in their faces. He climbed into Miriam's lap, his small arms curling around her neck. "I dreamed last night you were both gone," he said. Miriam pressed her lips to his temple. "We're here," she whispered. "We'll always be here." The rancher's hand brushed hers, calloused and steady, and she did not pull away. As the seasons turned again, life on the ranch became more than survival. Miriam planted a small garden by the cottonwood tree, vegetables and herbs pushing through the soil. Eli's cough faded into memory, his body filling with strength. The rancher laughed more often, his voice deep but softened, as though the weight on his shoulders had lightened. Miriam herself began to sing as she worked, old songs her mother once taught her, the melodies weaving through the air like threads of healing. The townsfolk still whispered, but their voices no longer mattered. What mattered was the boy's laughter, the man's steady gaze, the land yielding fruit where once it had only given dust. Miriam sometimes thought of the square, of the chains, of the cruel laughter. But now, when she remembered, she did not feel shame. She felt defiance, and strength, and the deep knowledge that out of that night of humiliation had grown a life no jeer could tarnish. And so the days stretched on, stitched together not by chains or bargains, but by choice, hard, stubborn, and enduring. Miriam knew the world had tried to define her by what it had taken, but here, in this ranch where sorrow and hope had mingled, she was building something greater, a family bound not by law or laughter, but by the fierce, unyielding truth of love. The ranch grew in quiet strength, as if the land itself had decided to reward those who had refused to abandon it. Seasons passed, marked not by calendars but by the smell of soil after rain, the taste of ripened corn, the sound of Eli's laughter as he chased calves in the pasture. Miriam's hands bore new scars from work and old ones from chains, but she carried them like scripture, each line a testament to survival. She no longer saw herself as a woman bought. She saw herself as a woman rooted, her feet steady in earth that once would have rejected her. Eli grew quickly. His cough, once his constant companion, became rarer until it vanished altogether. Strength filled his limbs, and with it came curiosity. He trailed after his father during branding, peppering him with questions, or lingered with Miriam in the kitchen, eyes bright as she read aloud from old books salvaged from trunks. He absorbed knowledge like dry soil drinks rain, and Miriam often caught the rancher watching with quiet wonder. The boy who once clutched his wooden horse in fear now carved new animals of his own, lining them along the mantle as if building a world he could command. But growth brought challenges. As Eli's strength returned, so too did his restlessness. He wanted to ride further, climb higher, venture into town alone. Miriam feared the cruelty of men's laughter still clinging there, but she could not chain him. One afternoon, she found him at the edge of the property, staring at the horizon. "What's out there?" he asked. "More land," she said. "More people, more trials, and more laughter." His voice carried a shadow of what he remembered, though he was young. "Maybe," she admitted, "but also more chances to prove them wrong." He nodded, thoughtful, and she knew the boy was beginning to understand that his life would not be sheltered forever. The rancher carried his own battles, quieter than the boy's but no less fierce. At night, when the house was still, he would sit by the fire, his hands clasped, staring into the flames. Miriam sometimes joined him, her presence wordless comfort. He carried guilt still, that he had spoken the words, $10, as if claiming property, that her life had turned because of his desperation. He wrestled with it in silence, fearing that one day she might rise from her place beside him, look at him with eyes stripped of forgiveness, and walk away. Yet each day she stayed, her actions spoke louder than the doubts that gnawed him. She tended Eli's scraped knees, mended his shirts, coaxed life from the garden. She rode into town at his side, chin high against whispers. She stood with him at the graveside of his wife during anniversaries, laying flowers at the cottonwood, her hand brushing his when words failed them both. Each act chipped away at the wall he had built around his grief, until sometimes, when he looked at her, he felt something frighteningly close to peace. The townsfolk's whispers did not vanish, but they changed. At first, Miriam was the auction bride, the woman bought in chains. Later, she became the one who carried herself with dignity no mockery could touch. Women who once sneered began asking her advice on mending or tending gardens. Men, grudgingly, admitted the ranch seemed stronger since she arrived. No one said it aloud, but the tide of perception shifted, though Miriam never sought it. She lived not for their approval but for the boy's laughter and the man's steady gaze. Years passed, marked by winters endured and summers harvested. Eli reached his 12th year, tall for his age, with eyes too wise for his youth. One day, he returned from town with fists clenched and lips trembling. Miriam knelt before him, coaxing the story. A boy had called him the auction son, sneering that his mama was bought like cattle. Eli had struck him, bloodied his nose, and fled. Miriam held his face in her hands. "You are not defined by their words," she said firmly. "You are defined by the strength in you, the kindness in your heart, and the choices you make. You are no one's shame." "But is it true?" His voice cracked. "Were you bought?" She drew a breath, the moment heavy as stone. "I was chained, yes. And your father spoke the words that freed me. Some call that buying. I call it saving. And what mattered is what came after. The life we've built, the love we've grown. Do you understand?" Tears filled his eyes. "I understand. I'd be dead without you." He threw his arms around her, clutching her so fiercely she could barely breathe. In that embrace, Miriam felt the last remnant of her shame dissolve. What the world called her mattered little. What Eli called her, his, was everything. The rancher listened from the doorway, unseen, and the tears he shed that night were for both of them. But peace never lasted long on the frontier. One spring, drought returned with a vengeance. The well dipped low, the cattle grew gaunt, and the garden shriveled under relentless sun. Miriam and the rancher worked themselves raw, hauling water from the river miles away, rationing food, praying for rain. Eli, though still a child, labored beside them, his shirt clinging with sweat, his face set with determination far beyond his years. One evening, after a day of brutal heat, Miriam collapsed on the porch steps, her body trembling with exhaustion. The rancher sat beside her, sweat streaking his face. "I sometimes think this land takes more than it gives," he muttered. Miriam lifted her gaze to the horizon, where the sky burned crimson. "It gives us Eli," she said softly. "And it gives us each other. That's more than enough." For the first time, he reached for her hand. His calloused fingers closed around hers, and though neither spoke further, the gesture carried more truth than words could hold. When the rains finally came, crashing down in torrents that turned the earth to mud, they danced in it, Eli leaping with joy, Miriam laughing as the water plastered her hair, the rancher's deep chuckle rising above the storm. In that moment, chains, auctions, whispers, all of it, felt washed away, replaced by the simple purity of survival rewarded. But fate, relentless, turned again. One autumn, the rancher fell ill. It began with a cough, deep and rattling, the kind Miriam had feared all her life. He brushed it off at first, insisting it was nothing, but soon fever gripped him, sweat soaking his sheets, breath shallow. Miriam's heart clenched with terror. She remembered Eli's sickness, remembered her brothers, remembered every grave dug too early. She refused to lose him. Day and night, she nursed him, pressing cool cloths to his brow, coaxing broth past his lips, whispering prayers into the dark. Eli sat beside her, his face pale with fear, clutching his father's hand. "Don't leave us," he whispered. Miriam held them both, her strength stretched thin but unyielding. There were nights she feared he would not wake. She lay her head against his chest, listening for the faint beat of his heart, willing it to continue. She whispered truths she had never spoken aloud, that she loved him, that she had loved him for years, that she would not know how to breathe if he left her. If he heard, he gave no sign. At last, after weeks of battle, the fever broke. His breathing steadied, his eyes opened, and Miriam wept into his chest, relief shaking her to the core. He stroked her hair with a hand weak but gentle. "You saved me," he whispered. She lifted her tear-streaked face. "No, you chose to stay." Their eyes met, and in that gaze all walls crumbled. He pulled her close, his lips finding hers, not with urgency but with the quiet certainty of a truth long delayed. When they parted, Eli, who had witnessed it from the corner, grinned through his tears. "Does this mean we're really a family now?" he asked. They both laughed, the sound breaking years of silence, and Miriam held them both, knowing the answer was already written in the life they had built. The years that followed carried new trials, storms that tore roofs, markets that crashed, sickness that came and went. But through it all, they endured, not as fragments bound by desperation, but as a family bound by love stronger than any chain. Miriam grew older, her hair streaked with silver, but her spirit remained fierce. The rancher carried scars from illness but walked with steadiness, his eyes never leaving hers for long. Eli grew into a man, tall, strong, with his father's determination and Miriam's unbreakable heart. The whispers in town faded into silence. No one spoke of auctions or chains anymore. They spoke of the ranch that thrived against drought, of the boy who grew into a man of honor, of the woman whose dignity turned scorn into respect. And though Miriam never sought their approval, she felt the victory in it, quiet and complete. At night, when the house was quiet, she would sometimes sit by the fire, the wooden horse still resting on the mantel. She would trace its worn edges, remembering the boy who once clung to it, the man who once feared to ask for her trust, the woman who once stood in chains. She would smile, knowing that laughter had been silenced, that love had taken root, and that the story of their lives had been written not by cruelty, but by the choices they made after. And in the stillness, she knew that no auctioneer, no chain, no laughter could ever undo what they had become. Eli grew into the kind of man the land itself seemed to recognize, broad-shouldered, sun-hardened, his hands strong but his eyes gentle. Miriam often marveled at him as she worked beside the stove or in the fields, remembering the fragile boy she once nursed through fever. He now commanded the herd with a whistle, repaired fences before the wind could claim them, and rode out across the pastures with the same watchful eye his father had. Yet within him still lived the boy who had once asked if he was the auction son. His heart was soft, even when his back was strong, and Miriam thanked God for that balance. By the time Eli turned 18, the rancher's hair had grayed, and lines had deepened across his face, but his presence had lost none of its weight. He had become more deliberate with his movements, careful with his strength, but his voice still held authority. Eli often challenged him, not in defiance, but in eagerness to take on more. Miriam watched their bond grow, father and son working side by side, their silences comfortable, their words few but meaningful. Yet she also saw something else, Eli's yearning. His gaze drifted beyond the horizon often, especially after rides into town. Miriam knew that look. She had worn it herself once, standing chained before strangers, longing for freedom. For Eli, it was not chains but the promise of something more, love, purpose beyond the ranch, perhaps even a family of his own. The first girl came with spring. Her name was Clara, the daughter of a shopkeeper in town. She had a quick smile and clever eyes, and Eli's attention clung to her like bees to blossom. Miriam saw it instantly, the way his voice stumbled when speaking to her, the way his gaze lingered. Clara visited the ranch once, bringing sweet rolls wrapped in paper. Miriam watched them laugh together on the porch, their joy so unguarded it stirred something deep in her, a memory of her own laughter, long before chains, long before sorrow. But Clara's family did not approve. Miriam overheard whispers when she accompanied Eli to town, that Clara's mother did not wish her daughter entangled with the auction woman's son. The words struck Miriam like an old wound reopening. She thought the whispers had died, but venom has a way of lying dormant, waiting for a chance to sting again. Eli, however, did not shrink. He faced Clara's parents with steady voice, declaring that his worth came not from their approval but from the life he had built with his family. Clara, torn between love and duty, wept in silence. She confessed to Eli one night, in the shadow of the barn, that she could not go against her parents' will. And just like that, their laughter ended, leaving Eli hollow-eyed and aching. Miriam held him as he wept, the way she had when he was a child. "Love is not lost," she whispered. "It only waits until the right soil is found. You'll see." Years passed, and Eli hardened into manhood. He carried heartbreak quietly, pouring himself into the ranch, into caring for his father whose strength waned further with each winter. Miriam, too, felt the years pressing against her bones. Her hands stiffened in the cold, her breath shortened after long work, but her spirit remained unbroken. She and the rancher shared evenings on the porch, speaking little, their silence filled with the weight of all they had survived together. Sometimes his hand would cover hers, warm and steady, and she would lean against him, her heart still steady with love. It was during one such evening that Eli returned from town with a woman at his side. Her name was Anna. Unlike Clara, she came not with sweetness but with strength. She was the daughter of a blacksmith, her palms calloused, her stance unflinching. She greeted Miriam with respect, not pity, and spoke to the rancher with the same steadiness Eli had inherited. Miriam's heart lifted. This was not a woman swayed by whispers, this was a woman who saw truth. Eli and Anna married the next spring beneath the cottonwood where the rancher's first wife lay. Miriam wept quietly through the vows, her heart aching with memory yet soaring with pride. When Eli and Anna exchanged rings, Miriam felt something close, an unspoken redemption. What had begun with laughter and chains had now led to a union born freely, blessed not by circumstance but by choice. Anna proved herself quickly. She labored beside Eli, bore the heat and storms without complaint, and soon carried the next generation within her. When Miriam held her first grandchild, a girl with Eli's dark eyes and Anna's firm grip, she felt as though the circle of her life had finally been mended. The laughter that had once mocked her now echoed in the tiny giggles of her granddaughter, pure and untainted by cruelty. But time is relentless, and even love cannot halt its march. The rancher's health declined, each winter stealing more from him. He grew thin, his steps faltering, until one spring morning he did not rise from bed. Miriam sat beside him, holding his hand, Eli and Anna nearby with the child nestled in Anna's arms. The rancher's eyes lingered on Miriam, soft with a love he had never spoken enough. "You saved us all," he whispered, his breath shallow. Miriam shook her head, tears streaming. "You saved me." He smiled faintly, a ghost of his old strength. "Then we saved each other." With those words, he slipped away, his hand still warm in hers, his face at peace. Miriam wept until her body shook, but through her grief burned gratitude, that she had known such love, that chains had led her to freedom in its truest form. The years that followed were marked by both loss and abundance. Miriam mourned, but she did not crumble. She poured her love into Eli's children, into the soil of the ranch, into the memory of the man she had walked beside. She grew old with dignity, her hair white as snow, her hands fragile yet tireless when it came to cradling her grandchildren. One evening, when her strength had nearly left her, she sat by the fire with Eli. He was a man now, his face weathered like his father's once was, his eyes still steady. Around them, Anna prepared supper, their children chasing one another through the halls. Miriam looked at her son, at the man he had become, and felt the weight of her life pressing gently upon her chest. "Eli," she said softly, "do you remember when you asked me if you were the auction son?" He nodded, his throat tight. "You were never that," she said. "You were the son of love, born in sorrow but raised in hope. Never forget that, and never let your children forget that our lives are not defined by chains, but by what we do once we are free." Eli took her hand, tears slipping down his face. "I'll never forget." That night, Miriam closed her eyes for the last time, the fire crackling low, Eli's hand wrapped around hers. She left the world not with the sound of jeers, but with the laughter of her grandchildren echoing in her ears, a sound pure and eternal. At her funeral beneath the cottonwood, townsfolk gathered. Many had once whispered, but now they stood in reverence. Eli spoke, his voice steady, his words carrying the weight of truth. "They laughed once when my mother stood in chains. They mocked her, and they mocked us. But she gave her life to turn laughter into silence, silence into respect, and respect into love. If you see this ranch, this family, this life we live, it is because of her strength. Let no one forget that she was never bought. She was the one who saved us." The crowd fell silent, heads bowed, the echoes of old cruelty finally laid to rest. Generations later, long after Eli too had passed, the ranch still stood. Children and grandchildren grew, their laughter ringing across the fields. And in the family's stories, told by firelight, Miriam lived on, not as the bride in chains, not as the woman mocked, but as the heart of it all, the one who turned despair into legacy. And when the wind rushed through the cottonwood, rustling its leaves, it carried not the memory of laughter, but the voice of a woman unbroken, whispering to those who came after, "You are free." live as though you always were. Thank you so much for watching this story till the very end. Your support means more than words can ever say. If you felt the depth of this journey, don't forget to give it a like, share it with someone who needs it, and most importantly, subscribe to the channel. Together, we'll keep bringing powerful stories to life, and your presence here makes all the difference.